voice of Ferouz, the greatest living singer of the Arab world. She's from Lebanon. She's singing about Baghdad, the city of poets. Good morning, I'm David Barsamian, and this is a special report on Iraq. The end-of-the-year execution of Saddam Hussein, initially described as an important milestone by President Bush, now seems to be a millstone around the president's head. December was the deadliest month for U.S. troops in 2006. The U.S. death toll now exceeds 3,000. 2 million Iraqis have fled their war-ravaged country. Internal refugees, also around 2 million. Neighborhoods and towns in Iraq are being communally cleansed. Hundreds of thousands of Iraqis have been killed since the U.S. invasion of March 2003. The solution to the ongoing, unrelenting carnage and mayhem in Iraq? According to CNN, the White House is planning to send anywhere from 20,000 to 40,000 additional troops to Iraq. The vice president talks of victory, and the president says we must win. And the Democrats? A big question mark. Joining us this morning to talk about Iraq is Anthony Arnove. He's an editor of the International Socialist Review and author of Iraq, the Logic of Withdrawal, a book with the foreword by Howard Zinn. This book has been praised by Arundhati Roy and Tariq Ali, and Anthony Arnove has been to Iraq. He's the editor of Iraq Under Siege. He's been carefully monitoring the events in that country. Good morning, Anthony. He joins us from New York.
Good morning, David. Thanks for having me on the program.
Well, it's good to have you with us. Your latest article in the International Socialist Review is Act 3 of a tragedy in many parts. I think most people would say, well, Act 1 was the invasion itself. Act 2 was some kind of transition period, and now we're in Act 3. Can you talk about that?
Well, I used Act 3 to refer to the Iraq Study Group report and the period of Iraq policy that we're now entering, where we're seeing efforts by this administration to salvage and now, as you point out, accelerate the occupation of Iraq with the possible dispatch of 30 to 50,000 more troops. And I think, unfortunately, we're in a situation where the prospects for continuing this occupation are very real. British troops are talking about being in Iraq until the year 2010. The Bush administration is making plans that could see troops in Iraq well beyond that point. And the reason that it's a tragedy is that each day this occupation continues, things get worse for ordinary Iraqis. Iraq now has the world's largest refugee crisis. It has, as you pointed out, an accelerating civilian death toll, with at least 1,930 civilians killed in Iraq in December. The toll is probably much higher than that. Those are very conservative estimates. A internal refugee problem as well as an external refugee problem. Prices are skyrocketing, unemployment is skyrocketing, and ethnic cleansing is taking place on a massive scale where Baghdad, in effect, is being ethnically cleansed, in particular of Sunnis. And the violent death toll, including the toll directly related to U.S. Atrocities, such as the ones that have recently been exposed in Haditha and Mahmudiyah, are also escalating as U.S. troops get more frustrated with the fact that they are overwhelmingly despised and hated by the Iraqi population, and they're put into a situation where atrocities are inevitable.
How has the U.S. policy in Iraq exacerbated the tension, sectarian divisions in the country? I should point out that the Shiites are the largest Muslim group in the country. They comprise about 60 to 65% of the population, and then there's the Sunni group, perhaps 20 to 25, and then the Kurdish minority. The Kurds are not Arabs at all and speak a different language. How has U.S. policy exacerbated the sectarian divisions?
Well, that's a very important question, and it's important to ask it that way because the way the establishment press and the way that Washington officials talk about the U.S. role in Iraq is that they're trying to stem sectarian conflict, that they're trying to unite Sunni and Shia and Kurd, and they're trying to build a plural democracy in Iraq. The reality is the United States, from the inception of its invasion in March 2003 and subsequent occupation, has been fueling sectarian conflict in Iraq. First of all, they brought into political leadership a number of exile groups, such as the Supreme Council for the Islamic Revolution in Iraq and the Shia Dawa Party that had ties to Iran and had ties to Shia militant groups that have been the heart of the militias that have been carrying out attacks on Sunni communities. Using cover of the Interior Ministry, using cover of Iraqi police uniform, official uniform, to carry out sectarian attacks. Also, the United States set up a constitutional framework that distributes political power on the basis of sectarian and religious and ethnic identity, so that the divisions between Sunni, Shia, and Kurd are institutionalized and reinforced. Then the United States has used a classic colonial divide and rule strategy of seeking to pit various groups against one another to gain political advantage and to form a government that will be pliable and that will be subservient to U.S. interests in Iraq, which would mean providing military bases and pursuing policies on vital questions such as oil policy, where the United States has immense strategic interests. They've lost their military base in Saudi Arabia, and they sought to gain greater control not only over Iraq's oil, which is the second largest reserve in the world, but the region, which has two-thirds of world oil reserves and also the greatest concentration of natural gas in the world, which is very important. So they want a government that will be pliable and that will give the U.S. a base in Iraq to project power regionally, and they've pitted groups against one another to gain advantage. And we've seen now an open debate about pursuing what's called an 80% solution, which would mean abandon the Sunnis and, in fact, encourage attacks on the Sunnis to try to consolidate Shia power. And then you see others saying that would be a disaster because it would strengthen Iran's hand in the region, and so therefore we have to find a way of actually creating a Sunni bloc against the Shias. So every day that the U.S. is there, it's fomenting sectarian divisions, and furthermore, by setting up a government which is not legitimate in the eyes of most Iraqis, which is seen as a collaborationist government, any Iraqi who's part of the police, who's part of the military, part of the security apparatus, is seen as serving a foreign occupation. And so, therefore, that's sowing greater internal conflict in Iraq as well.
The Iraq Study Group, this commission that was led by former Secretary of State and Bush family confidant Jim Baker and Lee Hamilton, former Democratic congressman, and a host of elders, as it were, came out with its report in December. It described the situation in Iraq as grave and deteriorating. The term oil was used 63 times in the course of the report. How central, you said that Iraq has the second largest reserves. Is oil the single most important driving factor that keeps the occupation going?
I think oil is the central reason that the United States invaded Iraq, and it's a primary reason why the United States remains. But I think we now have to add a couple of other dimensions. The United States went into Iraq with claims that it would reshape the entire Middle East, that Iraq would be beginning of a series of regime changes in the region. They call it a blossoming of democracy, but really what they were talking about was potentially toppling the governments in Iran, in Syria, and setting up a regional framework of order far more favorable to U.S. interests than the one that was in place in 2003. The reality is they now found themselves in a much weaker position. They've emboldened Iran. Israel, which they encouraged to invade Lebanon this summer, is also now in a weaker position, having been defeated by the forces of Hezbollah. And the United States now is in a position where it's weaker, and ideologically there is a risk that, having gone into Iraq claiming that they would bury once and for all the Vietnam syndrome, the kind of reluctance of some people in the United States for the U.S. to be a global cop, to be a global bully, would be the more accurate way of describing it. They now fear that there would be an Iraq syndrome, that if the United States left Iraq having been defeated, it would limit the ability of the United States to project its power, not just in the Middle East, but in Asia, in Africa, in Latin America, and elsewhere, so that the U.S. would emerge much weaker on the global stage. So now that there's much more at stake in so-called face-saving in Iraq, and the price for that face-saving is going to be paid by U.S. soldiers, as you pointed out, now more than 3,000 dead, more than 22,000 injured, more than half of those injured unable to ever return to military service because of the degree of their injuries. And, of course, it's being paid by Iraqis, and the price is a very high one indeed.
According to the Lancet, which is a respected British magazine, they cite the figure of 655,000 Iraqis killed since March 2003. What kind of credibility do you give to that figure?
I think it's a very important and credible study. The figure is actually of excess deaths, not of Iraqis killed, which is an important distinction, because what the Lancet study looks at, using the standard epidemiological methods, is population trends in Iraq. And they use as a baseline Iraq in 2003, which we should remember was a devastated society, a society that had been subjected to more than 12 years of punishing economic sanctions, which had led to hundreds of thousands of deaths already, unnecessary deaths, promoted by the U.S. enforcement of those UN sanctions. But what they then said is, all other things being equal, if population trends had continued in Iraq, what would we expect the population of Iraq to be today? And what they found is that with the increase of violent deaths, the increase of deaths due to disease, starvation, malnutrition, etc., related to the economic and social consequences of the war, coupled with declines in the birth rate in Iraq, lead to a conservative figure, the median figure of their survey, at 655,000. It may be more, it may be less, but it used the standard method of cluster sampling, the same kinds of methods that are cited by the Bush administration in giving numbers for deaths in Darfur, for example, or in a number of other areas where they have an interest in highlighting the number of people who have been killed, as opposed to Iraq, where they're consistently trying to downplay any discussion of Iraqi deaths or Iraqi suffering.
Returning to the United States, the November 2006 congressional elections were seen as a rebuke of the president's Iraq policy, and that Iraq was very high on the list of voter concerns, and that the Democrats would somehow provide a way out. Well, the Democrats are taking over the Congress today. What hope, what signs do you see that perhaps those voter concerns will be realized by the Democratic Party?
Well, I'm very skeptical about the Democratic leadership that's taking over in Congress today.
Why do you say that?
Nancy Pelosi and Harry Reid, the leader of the Senate and House for the Democratic majorities, have both said that they will not cut off funding for the war. They've also now said that they will not consider any impeachment proceedings against President Bush. you have top Democrats, including the leader, Carl Levin of the Armed Services Committee, saying that they will consider or support the idea of sending more troops to Iraq, 30,000, 40,000, perhaps 50,000 more troops, which we're likely to hear George Bush announce in a speech in the next week. And we have a Democratic Party that has consistently voted for the supplemental bills to continue funding of the war. And there's another supplemental bill coming up next month that probably is going to ask for $100 billion more for the occupation of Iraq and also of Afghanistan. And I think really it's going to take much more popular pressure on the Democrats to force them and also to force the Republicans to begin a process of bringing the troops home. The Democratic Party leadership has to have its feet held to the fire, and I think the elections were a clear vote against the war. People were not voting to have hearings. People were not voting for more oversight for the war. They were voting for a fundamental change in policy, and it's going to take things like the demonstration that's been called in Washington on January 27th by United for Peace and Justice and other anti-war groups with local actions happening around the country. It's going to take actions like that to really hold the Democrats accountable.
Yesterday in Washington, Cindy Sheehan and others disrupted a meeting by Rahm Emanuel, a House Democrat from Illinois.
I think that was a brilliant example of the kind of things we need to be doing much more often. It was a really fantastic event. And then when Emanuel fled the scene, Cindy Sheehan was able to then talk to the press and put out a very clear case for bringing the troops home from Iraq. And it's a case that more and more people in this country support. Opinion polls show very clearly a clear majority, thinking the war was a mistake and opposing Bush's policy in Iraq. You also have more troops in recent polls saying they want to come home. 72%, according to a poll that was published in the Military Times, done by Zogby International's active duty troops in Iraq, saying that they wanted to be out by the end of 2006. We're now into 2007. So there's a beginning of a GI rebellion taking place among the ranks in Iraq, with groups at home like Iraq Veterans Against War playing an increasingly important role of giving a voice to those GIs who are speaking out, refusing to redeploy or refusing their initial deployments to Iraq. And if George Bush tries to send 30, 40,000, 50,000 more troops, I think we're going to see more of that because, in effect, we already have a backdoor draft in this country. And given that the U.S. military is badly overstretched, to send more troops to Iraq is going to involve calling out more reservists, holding people much longer than their expected tours of duty, and it's going to create more discontent. And that's a very important element to the story of what's happening now in Iraq, because if you go back to the Vietnam War, and there's many important analogies I think that can be drawn between the Vietnam War and the situation the U.S. is now in Iraq, you see that it was soldiers speaking out against that war that really played an instrumental role in helping bring it to an end.
You mentioned in passing the draft. It's often said, sometimes cynically, that, well, the American people are not going to really rebel in a way that they did in the 1960s and 1970s unless there is a draft.
I actually disagree with that assessment. I think, first of all, it downplays the extent to which this war has involved a backdoor draft. Communities around this country have been severely affected by the economic costs of this war, which Joseph Stiglitz at Columbia University and a colleague at Harvard University now estimate to be $1.6 trillion if you include the indirect economic costs as well as just the direct funding for the occupation. Communities have been torn apart by the call-up of reservists who have been kept in Iraq well past their expected tours of duty through stop-loss programs and the individual ready reserve. You have now more than 3,000 dead, 22,000 injured. So people are being affected by this war. Also, though, if you go back to the Vietnam era, I think it's simplistic to say that it was the draft that led people to oppose that war and to come out into the streets and to protest. One of the most powerful images that galvanized sentiment against the Vietnam War was an image of a Vietnamese girl fleeing a village that had been bombed with napalm by U.S. forces. And it was sympathy with the Vietnamese people and a sense of solidarity that these people who we claimed to be liberating, we were in fact causing tremendous harm to, that led people to speak out. There was also a very important connection with the civil rights movement at the time. And I think that element it needs to be explained as well, that there was a sense of ferment in the country at the time, a sense of mobilizing for change that spilled over into a whole range of social movements around women's rights, gay rights, rights of African Americans, and was linked up by people like Martin Luther King to the struggle against the Vietnam War. And I think if we could make some of those connections today, which are desperately needed, for example, making connections between the situation of the victims of Hurricane Katrina, the victims of that social disaster, not just natural disaster, with the situation in Iraq, I think we could galvanize more sentiment against this war.
We just have a couple of minutes left, Anthony Arnove. I want you to talk about elites in this country who seem to be now seriously divided. You have the Iraq Study Group, people around the Council on Foreign Relations, other groups and organizations that really see their own long-term interests seriously undermined by the war in Iraq. And then you have the other contending group, the Bush White House, saying surge and accelerate. How is that going to play out?
Well, I think how it's going to play out depends on how we in the anti-war movement take advantage of the cracks that are opening up at the top. As you point out, there are serious divisions now among U.S. elites. You have a number of people in the business community who see that the U.S. image in the world has never been weaker than it is today, that there has been a direct material impact on the ability of the United States to operate as an economic superpower with U.S. goods, U.S. corporations being tainted by association with President Bush and by association with the U.S. occupation of Iraq. That's having an effect on the bottom line. And so I think you're more likely to see a shift in the coming years to a more multilateralist approach, a more kind of soft power, as it's sometimes called, approach to the projection of U.S. power. But the problem is that the U.S. is in a bind, and the Democrats are in this bind as much as the Republicans. No one wants to be seen as losing Iraq. And that dynamic existed in the Vietnam War. If you go back to as early as 1965, but certainly by 67, 68 with the Tet Offensive, there was a recognition among U.S. military planners, but also U.S. political elites, that the U.S. had lost the war in Vietnam, and yet it continued until 1973, and really the last troops didn't leave until 1975. So I fear that we're in a similar situation, an analogous situation today, and that unless there's much more popular pressure to bring the troops home, to cut off funding for this war, for immediate withdrawal, we could see a very bloody endgame indeed.
You're a regular contributor to the International Socialist Review, and you've got an article in the current issue. Could you give their website?
Yes, it's isreview.org.
isreview.org. And your book, Iraq, The Logic of Withdrawal, with a foreword by Howard Zinn. How can people get a copy of that?
People can get copies at their local bookstores and at online stores, and also through the American Empire Project website, which is AmericanEmpireProject.org.
Thanks very much for joining us this morning, Anthony Arnove.
Thanks, David.
I've been talking to Anthony Arnove, who joined us from New York. He's the author of the new book, Iraq, The Logic of Withdrawal. He's also a regular contributor to the International Socialist Review. I'm David Barsamian. Thanks for listening, and we go out with a bit of music from Ferouz.
ليلة